Hi, my name is Stacy Music, and I am a staff developer for the LIU, and I will be leading you today through this advanced session, Light Up the Learning Brain, Translating Brain Science into Student Support. We have just one learning intention for our time together, and that is to apply brain science to select supports that increase students' readiness and ability to learn. If you joined me for the beginner session, we looked closely at how the brainstem, which is this area right here, I like to call it the downstairs brain, needs to feel safe and protected in order for the amygdala, right here, to allow access and connection to the prefrontal cortex, which I like to call the upstairs brain. This upstairs brain is where rational thinking and learning happen. So this advanced session will focus on how to support students to stay regulated so that they can be fully functioning in their upstairs brain, that prefrontal cortex, and do their best thinking and learning. And we're going to break this down for you into 3 points of support. The base or the foundation is co-regulation. Then we will talk about how to support learning input, or in other words, how to help students access what they are trying to learn. And then we'll talk about executive function output. In other words, the way that a student takes what they've learned and they do something or produce something to show what they have learned. So throughout today's session, I have what I'm calling paraphrases. These are key points just for you that I think would be really helpful for you to remember and take back with you in the important work that you do with your students. So the first paraphrase is co-regulate so you can educate. In the beginner session, we had the paraphrase regulate so you can educate, and we focused on strategies for you as the adult to regulate yourself first so that you're able to then co-regulate your students. In this session, we will look at strategies to support the co-regulation of your students so that they're able to stay connected to that upstairs part of their brain so that they can do their best thinking and learning. Now, we did cover this slide in the first session, but I think it's important for us to quickly review this before we move into those co-regulation supports. So what is co-regulation? It might be actually more helpful to think about first what co-regulation is not. Co-regulation is not keeping ourselves in a constant state of calm, because that would be fairly impossible for most of us to do, especially in our line of work. Our bodies and brains go through so many events in the course of a day, and those events can cause a wide range of emotions and responses, just like a roller coaster. What co-regulation is the ability to come back into a state of balance as we experience that roller coaster in our daily life. The co part is how we influence another individual as they're experiencing the events of their day. A regulated adult can help a student stay or become regulated. Being regulated simply means that the state of the nervous system matches the needs of the moment. And not every moment needs calm. Sometimes we need some activation. So I like to think of this in terms of gas, brakes, and speed limit. Sometimes we need a little bit of gas in the moment. So that means we need some extra activation, something to heighten our alertness or to raise our energy. Other times we might need, or our students might need, to put on the brakes. And that's when we do need that calm and those low and slow gestures and movements and tone of voice and that settling energy. And then the key is finding just the right amount of gas and brake to support the student's needs in that moment, which I like to think of as the speed limit. So it's that level that's needed for the current situation that the student is in. So, what are some signs of dysregulation? As we go down through this list, I'm sure you'll be able to think of students who you have worked with who have demonstrated these signs of dysregulation: off task or disruptive behavior, movement or restlessness, irritability or defiance, tears of frustration, apathy, or work avoidance. A mindset reframe that I would like for you to consider is that instead of thinking, how do I stop this behavior? Maybe ask yourself, how do I support this student back to a state of regulation? Think about that speed limit from the previous slide. How do I get them functioning at the speed limit, the right amount of gas and brakes in order to be successful in the moment? So let's look at what you can do when a student needs the breaks. The first thing that you can try is using fewer words. As educators, we like to explain everything to our students, right? But when we over-explain in a moment of dysregulation, we can often push a student into heightened dysregulation or even into a complete meltdown or shutdown, or sometimes it can turn into a back and forth power struggle. So we really want to save that talking for times when the student is regulated. Another way to support a student who needs the breaks is just to use a slower pace. Slow down your talking, your gestures. And what often happens is that the student will start to mirror your slower, calmer demeanor, which brings them back into a state of regulation. Another great strategy is breathing and grounding. The nervous system often needs a cue from the body before it can access a thinking cue. This goes back to the connection between the downstairs and upstairs brain that we talked about in the first session and also on the first slide. Signaling safety and calm in the body first is a great way to move a dysregulated brain out of protection mode and into connection and learning mode. And there are things that we can do in our body that signals that safety to the brain. So one easy way to do that is just prompting our students to have a long exhale to move some of that dysregulated energy out of their system. And once they get those exhales out, then they're more able to take those calm and cleansing inhales. Another way that we can prompt our students is to have them just drop and relax their shoulders. Our body naturally holds a lot of stress and tension in our shoulders. And when we're doing that, we're inadvertently signaling to our body that we're basically in a protection mode and we're bracing for the next threat or bad thing that comes our way. So just by tensing up our shoulders, we could be sending signals to our body and brain that puts us into a state of dysregulation. So just bringing awareness to that and having your students just relax their shoulders makes a big difference. Okay, so we have stretching, tapping, and humming. So stretching, you might be thinking, well, that could be used when a student needs gas, and you're absolutely right. But it's also included when a student needs breaks because many stretches that we do actually can activate the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is the nerve that runs all through the nervous system, and whenever it is activated, it signals a calm, safe response to your nervous system, which allows you and your body to start to feel calm and regulated once again. So if you're interested in some of those specific stretches, if you just look up stretching to activate the vagus nerve, you can find lots of ideas on how to help your students with that. Tapping is another way to send a signal to that vagus nerve, which gives that soothing, calming effect. I actually usually like to have students start just by putting their hand on the top of their chest, and that little bit of pressure on the chest starts to make them more aware of their heartbeat and their breathing. And that little bit of pressure starts to slow that down, which starts to signal to the body that it's safe and that it can come back into a state of regulation. And then I sometimes have them add the tapping, which is just the rhythmic tapping from the thumb down to the pinky, and doing that in a continuous motion just to bring about that calming effect to the body. And then the third one that I added here is humming. I didn't know this when I was a teacher. I was a classroom teacher for 26 years, and I will admit that when I would have students humming during class, I would be the teacher who was like, "Who's humming? Why are you humming? Why are you making that noise while we're trying to work?" But what I now know is when we hum, the vibration of our vocal cords actually activates that vagus nerve, which stimulates that regulation and that calming response. So when students just spontaneously start humming, many times it's their way of trying to regulate themselves, and they probably don't even realize they're doing it. Another idea is to prompt students to put a little bit of pressure on their hands or feet. So just pushing the palms of the hands together, or pushing down on the feet and having them bring awareness to themselves in that present moment and feeling that pressure on their hands or feet. And then lastly, sensory input. We know that sensory input is very individualized, so it's really a matter of learning what works best for each student. But options could include things like tactile sensory strips, a weighted lap blanket. If you work with younger kids, maybe a stuffed animal. Sometimes it's as simple as a drink or a small snack. Cold and crunchy can often have a very regulating effect on the nervous system. Now we're going to move into some ways to support a student who needs some gas. Here is where movement can be really helpful. When using movement, it's important to build in structure, because if it's unstructured, just like a random dance party or just jumping around, we know that that can really get students heightened. It can increase dysregulation. We're actually trying to put structure to it so that it can regulate them. So what that might look like is like rhythmic motions, doing a specific number of exercises and counting them and doing them together. That way it's structured and organized. Maybe having them do a motion that's directly connected to a learning outcome, acting out a vocabulary word, something like that. Many times when kids need a little bit of gas, it's because they're actually feeling a little bit overwhelmed or shut down. So a great way that we can support them in this moment is to break a task into short, manageable steps to help them overcome their overwhelm. Think about yourself. So when it's time to clean the house, exercise, or do some other activity that you feel like you don't quite have the energy to do, usually if you start with one small step, then you start to feel some success and motivation to keep going. And it's the same thing for our students. Most students are motivated by small celebrations, words of affirmation, high fives, fist bumps, smiles. And then we also included sensory input on this list as well, keeping in mind that we have to learn what our students seek and what our students avoid, and how we can really tap into those preferences in order to support and prompt those students to become and stay regulated. So when we reach that speed limit with our students, we want to maintain the speed limit in order to keep them regulated and keep them doing their very best thinking and learning. In moments of regulation, this is when you can teach your students about their own regulation. You can talk to them about what it means to have gas moments and breaks moments. Share strategies with them that they can try on their own. Encourage them to pay attention to their own body, what makes them feel regulated, what makes them feel ready to learn. Also, when a student is regulated, this is when you can provide scaffolds as learner entry points into whatever the academic task is required of them in that moment. And we will look at some specific examples of academic scaffolds just a little bit later. Another way to support a regulated student is through the gradual release of responsibility. Typically, we think of this as the I do, we do, you do. You're doing modeling and guided practice and supporting throughout. When they get to that I do independent part, we're still monitoring, trying to support them in staying regulated and on task with whatever the academic task is, and providing that supportive feedback to keep them regulated and on track. So these are just some of the ways that you can support students in co-regulation. So the paraphrase was co-regulate so you can educate. Now we're going to move on to that educate part and talk about how we can support students as they learn. So it's time to support learning. When the downstairs brain is safe and the nervous system is regulated, the student is finally ready and able to light up the learning brain, which is that prefrontal cortex or that upstairs brain. So I think it's important for us to talk now through what is happening in the brain whenever our students or ourselves, whenever we are learning something new. So all learning starts with some type of an input from the environment, and that includes the teacher and you as the paraprofessional. So we know we have to pay attention for something in order to be able to learn it. So one of the ways that you can scaffold and support students is just through helping to keep their attention focused during the classroom instruction, right? And then if the student attends to the new information, it first moves into this working memory. And what we know about the working memory is that it has a limited capacity. Originally, it was thought to hold 7 pieces of information, which is why phone numbers are 7 digits long. However, with there no longer being a need to memorize phone numbers, brain scans now show that for most people, the working memory is limited to only 3 or 4 pieces of information at one time. So if too much new information goes into our students' brains at one time, the brain just automatically goes into cognitive overload and the information slips right out and it is forgotten. It's like it goes in one ear and it goes out the other. So one of the biggest ways that you're going to scaffold to support what's happening in your students' brains is through scaffolding those entry points and giving them those ways to keep this working memory from becoming overloaded. So chunking information, presenting information in an organized way, showing how one concept connects to another, only giving them a little bit of information at a time, having them then engage with that information before you give them the next new piece. So once the information's in that working memory, 3 or 4 pieces at a time, then we need to support the students as they engage with it. Ways that they engage include speaking, writing, or doing. When we have them speaking, writing, or doing, what happens then is the neurons start to follow a path. They start to create a neural pathway, which is the beginning of learning, and that information starts to move towards the long-term memory. Once the information gets to the long-term memory, the neural circuit is not yet complete. If we stop when we think students understand something, here's what happens. Over a very short period of time, the majority of that information is forgotten. So what we need to understand here is that once they understand it and we first get it into the long-term memory, we have to complete the neural circuit by giving them opportunities to retrieve or remember that information. That simply means we're building in repetition and giving them opportunities to bring that information back into the working memory, engaging with it a little bit more, practicing it, repeating it. And the more repetitions that we provide for students, And the more we provide support so that they don't become overloaded and we help keep them engaged, then that learning will eventually become permanent learning for them. So that is a very brief and quick overview of what is happening in the brain. So now, how do we support those functions in our students? Well, the next paraphrase is lower the barrier, not the bar. And here is what I mean by that. When we're talking about scaffolds, we are talking about providing our students with just enough support in order for them to have safety, that's that co-regulation piece, and the ability to access new skills and concepts without that working memory becoming overloaded and shut down. So I want you to remember the acronym SAS, because I know all educators have a little bit of sass in them. If you're doing this with somebody else, turn and in your sassiest para voice, tell them that scaffolds provide support, access, and safety. Go ahead and do that. So what do we mean by lower the barrier, not the bar? Some folks might think that when we scaffold, we're making the learning too easy for our students, but we really want to reframe that thinking. We're not making the learning easy, we're making it accessible. So as you can see in this animated image, we want all of our students to make it to the top of the ladder. That's the bar. But we know that's not going to look the same for everyone. And that's where our support with our sassy scaffolds come in. Some students are going to need support, but we can still get them there. So when we scaffold, we lower the barrier, not the bar. Support, access, safety. So some specific examples of how you can provide that support to keep that working memory from becoming overloaded. One way is to connect to previous learning. And when we do that, we're also completing that neural loop and giving them that opportunity to complete that neural circuit and to strengthen it. Doing the first step together just helps them to pay attention and to get that information in. Chunking and organizing information. When we put it in, when we give that information in an organized fashion and show how concepts connect to each other, it keeps that working memory from becoming overloaded, and it also takes up less space. Whenever we chunk information that's related to each other, we actually have more space in the working memory because things that go together, neurons that fire together, wait a minute, I said that wrong. Yes, neurons that fire together, wire together. So whenever concepts connect, they basically create a chunk, and then that only takes up one space in the working memory instead of those 2 or 3 or 4 random spaces. Another way that we can support that healthy cognitive load of that working memory is by breaking large tasks into smaller subtasks. So now let's look at like some specific ways that we can actually put these scaffolds into practice. So I know that as a para, probably a lot of the time when you're supporting students is in the classroom while the teacher is teaching, and you're basically trying to help your student pay attention, help them to make sense of the information, help them feel supported so they don't become overloaded and shut down, to keep them continually engaging and processing and learning. So graphic organizers are a great way to do that. We'll look at 3 of them in a moment. If you're working with younger students, maybe just using some print tracking devices in order to keep their attention focused and to make them not lose their place. During writing time is when a lot of kiddos might feel overwhelmed and shut down. So you could try this quick little strategy, right to the line. So if the teacher's asking them to fill a page, maybe you just make a line halfway down and say, let's just try to get to this line first. And then when they get there, really hype them up, give them all of that positive praise, and then see if they continue from there. And then another way to support while the teacher is teaching is just to quietly pause and paraphrase with the student periodically to make sure that they're able to process and comprehend the content that the teacher is teaching. All right, so those graphic organizers, let's do the T chart. So sorry, that's actually being covered up a little bit by my image there. But a T chart is basically just a big capital letter T. So it's very kid friendly. Kids can make it on their own. And this is a great tool to use if the teacher's doing like reading from a text, a shared reading, science or social studies class, whatever it might be. And it's a way for you to help the student organize their thoughts and to understand the connections of the concepts. It's very versatile. It can be used in many different ways. So here's a couple of examples. So what you could do is have the student write the main idea on the left side, and then you could write the supporting details on the right. They could write facts on one side and then opinions on the other. Another way, cause on one side and then the effect on the other. Really, the ideas here are endless. So anything that you can divide into two categories and to organize it that way and to show the connections, the T-chart will work beautifully for that. And then the nice thing is that all students can make a capital letter T, so eventually it can be used independently by the student, even when you're not there to support them. Another great graphic organizer is a Foursquare. This one is really helpful whenever the student needs to plan what they're going to write. So the main idea would go in the center. I do have some tips here for you as you're supporting the student in determining the main idea. 10 words or less, the most important who or what, and the most important thing about the who or what. And then from there, you can help the students brainstorm what are those important supporting details and the conclusion. Just another tip here, if you're working with a student who has a hard time answering questions in complete sentences, have them use a SMART start, which is simply starting your answer by using words from the question. And that's just a smart way to start your answer. And it reduces some of that cognitive load and keeps that working memory from becoming overloaded. And then one other graphic organizer that you can use that's very versatile is a flow chart. It's really just giving them a visual representation of information, helping them to sequence items or events, display those cause and effect relationships. So the whole purpose of graphic organizers is really just to keep your students focused, keep their attention focused, and to help them organize and make sense of whatever the content is that the teacher is teaching. Okay, so that was a very fast and furious overview of how to use some academic scaffolds to support students. Remember, lower the barrier, not the bar, support, access, and safety. And now we're going to move into that final component, which is executive functioning. So our paraphrase here is executive functioning takes knowledge input and organizes it into meaningful output. So everything that the student learns, that's the input, and then they have to be able to do something with it. That's the output, and that's where executive function comes in. So executive function includes all of these life skills that you see listed here. Things like setting goals, problem solving, planning, organizing, managing time. Working memory is also included in there. The thing to keep in mind with executive function is that it requires skills and effort. So as you're supporting a student, you have to decide, do they need support in developing this skill, or do they already have the skill and they just need a little bit of support in order to sustain their effort or to keep their stamina going? You could ask yourself, is it a skill gap or is it a stamina gap? Deficits in executive functioning can look like things like laziness, apathy, avoidance, rushing, carelessness. But many times it's just that they don't have the skill or they don't have that stamina developed yet, and they need that little bit of support from you. So let's start with skill gaps. How can we support skill gaps? First thing and most important thing to keep in mind here is that reminders don't work if they don't have the skill yet. I think about my youngest daughter with this one. I gave her so many reminders growing up, and I experienced a lot of frustration as I continuously told her to clean her room and she didn't do it. It wasn't until I walked her through step by step each specific task that needed to be completed, and then she started to improve in her ability to clean her room. So reminders only work if the skill is already there. So when building skills, we need to be teaching and modeling. We're building that neural pathway. Thinking back to that diagram of the brain, we're building that pathway, and we're supporting them to move the information from the working memory toward the long-term memory. Ways to do this include breaking the task into visible steps, thinking aloud, first I do this, next I do that, providing guided practice, and using visuals and checklists. Many of these strategies are the same scaffolds that we've already talked about when supporting new academic learning and when supporting regulation. All of these scaffolds are kind of useful in all of the areas that we've talked about today. Now let's talk about stamina gaps. This is when they have the skill, but they just need the support to maintain it. So in this situation, you're going to support so that they can sustain. So thinking back to that diagram of the brain, the pathway is already built. We just need to strengthen the pathway. So it's like we're giving them those opportunities to retrieve and that repetition to strengthen the pathway until it becomes permanent for them. So a couple of strategies to keep in mind for this. Big tasks become doable when the first step is small. Use timers or short work intervals. Set clear finish lines with lots of positive reinforcement. And provide progress check-ins to see how well they're doing with upholding their stamina. And then this last one I think is probably the most helpful. Finish every work session by stating the first step for the next time. I even would have students write it down on a Post-it note. That way, when they come in the next day, it doesn't take any working memory capacity. It's right there for them, and they automatically know where they can jump in and get started. So then that first step becomes small and easy for them. That was a very brief overview of executive function because we have such a short time together. But let me end it by reviewing with you, those 3 points of support that you can be providing as a paraprofessional. First, co-regulation. Remember the paraphrase, regulate so you can educate. The state of the nervous system matches the needs of the moment, and we're trying to help the student find and maintain that appropriate speed limit. Next, supporting learning input through those scaffolds. And with our scaffolds, the paraphrase is lower the barrier, not the bar. So we're viewing scaffolds as learner entry points. A little bit of para-SAS, right? Support, access, and safety. And then lastly, executive function output. It's taking the knowledge and turning it into something meaningful. And remember, we have to decide, does the student need support in the skill, building the skill, or just strengthening their stamina? So back to today's learning intention, apply brain science to select supports that increase students' readiness and ability to learn. And then how will you act on what you learned today? Did you learn something that you can apply in your role? Did you learn something that might make you change your mindset or change the way you do something? And did you learn something that you could teach to a colleague or even teach your students? And then after you've had some time to reset and process all of this information, I encourage you to come back with some colleagues and reflect on these processing questions. And I would just like to thank you so much for joining me today. I know that was a lot of information, but I hope you were able to pull a few helpful strategies out. And I wish you the best of luck this school year as you continue to provide support so that your students can do their very best thinking and learning. Thank you so much. Have a great school year.